Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we take a giant stack of source material, really sift through it all, and basically hand you the foundational knowledge you need. Think of it as a genuine shortcut to getting properly well-informed.
Mm.
Today, we're undertaking a truly massive deep dive. We're going way back to the very roots of the English language and its literary tradition.
That's right.
Our focus is Anglo-Saxon literature. We're drawing heavily from critical histories that analyze this period of really profound cultural transformation. It often gets mistakenly labeled the Dark Ages, doesn't it?
It really does. And our mission today is, I think, pretty clear. We want to help you quickly and thoroughly understand this foundational period of English literary history. We're going to look at how a culture that arrived here as, well, let's be frank, pagan, seafaring barbarians in the eyes of some, how they fused their fierce, heroic ideals with the sophistication of Christian civilization, and how that fusion produced the earliest great works written in something we can finally call English.
So it's a foundational story then. Language, survival.
And deep existential tension. It's fascinating stuff.
All right, let's start by setting the calendar. When we talk about Anglo-Saxon literature, we're not talking about the Middle Ages like, castles and knights in shining armor that most people picture. What are the sort of anchor points for this period?
Yeah, good question. We're firmly rooted in the period starting around the mid-5th century AD,
Okay.
say 450 if you need a specific date. And it runs right up to that catastrophic, system-altering event, the Norman conquest in 1066.
Wow, so over 6 centuries. That's a huge span of time.
It really is. And critically, this era begins almost immediately after the Great Withdrawal. The Romans, having established their empire across Britain,
Right.
they decided to pull their legions out around 410 AB.
And what did they leave behind? I mean, it wasn't a complete cultural vacuum, was it? But they did leave a weakened infrastructure and a populace that was Christianized, at least in part, but fundamentally vulnerable.
Exactly. They left a partially Romanized, partially Christianized territory, which was, frankly, ripe for invasion. The stage was pretty much cleared for this sudden, rapid migration of Germanic invaders.
The Angles, Saxons, Jutes.
Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and the Frisians, too. These groups came in and established what would become the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent, all those.
Right.
And the literature we're studying today is the intellectual, the emotional product of these people. It reflects the earliest phase of the English language itself, and you can still see those unmistakable linguistic ties back to their continental Germanic cousins.
So these weren't people who grew up reading, say, Virgil or Ovid. They were bringing a completely different culture with them. Highly formalized, yes, but oral. Right.
Absolutely. And that sets up the central conflict, doesn't it? This collision of paganism and, well, civilization as the Romans or Christians would have defined it.
That collision, you said earlier, it's the engine driving the whole period.
I think it is. We have to remember that, to the Romans and certainly to the later Christian chroniclers, these invaders were seen as barbarians. They were outside the familiar structures of the Greco-Roman world. But the literature itself is proof, really, that they were far from uncultured. They were highly organized. They had a fierce ethical code.
It makes me think back to the Roman historian Tacitus. He wrote Germania way back in the 1st century AD.
Yes.
And he had this almost idealized, you could say romantic, view of the Germanic tribes. He praised their, uncorrupted martial prowess, their simple loyalty, their fierce independence, especially compared to what he saw as decadent Romans.
That's a vital connection. Tacitus really admired their customs, their dedication to tribal life, and the Anglo-Saxon literary story, in a way, picks up precisely there. It traces how that fierce, proud pagan heritage, the very thing Tacitus admired, was forced to reckon with and then gradually fuse with the new spiritual framework of Christianity.
And also the written traditions of Greco-Roman learning that came with Christianity.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a complex fusion.
So the challenge wasn't just translating Latin texts into Old English. It was translating an entire worldview, the code of the heroic warrior. Translating that into a framework defined by things like humility and grace.
That's the deepest analytical insight you can take from this period, I think. The source material really emphasizes that we have to view the study of this literature as the key to understanding how thought and civilization grew alongside those, quote-unquote, barbarian ideals.
It's not a simple replacement story, then.
Not at all. It's a dynamic, complicated synthesis. The Germanic emphasis on, say, loyalty, vengeance, the transient nature of earthly glory. All that had to be reconciled somehow with the Christian focus on eternal salvation, charity, and enduring spiritual permanence.
That tension, that must be what defines the literature.
It is, this constant push and pull between the secular heroic code and the religious ethic. That's the defining literary dynamic of the 5th right through to the 11th centuries. It's what gives the poetry its unique and often quite melancholy flavor.
And if we ignore this complexity, we just see the Dark Ages, right? Just a gap.
Exactly, but by studying the literature, you see a vibrant, challenging period of high culture formation. That alone justifies this deep dive, I think.
Okay, so let's move past the history, fascinating as it is, and get into the written word itself. For anyone who, looks at a manuscript of Old English for the first time, it's a shock.
Oh,
It
absolutely.
looks almost completely foreign. What are we actually calling this language, and why is it so divorced from the English we speak today?
Well, we call it Old English, or sometimes Anglo-Saxon, and fundamentally it is a Germanic language. It's far closer structurally to modern German or even Icelandic than it is to, say, Shakespearean English, let alone modern English.
How so?
It retains a highly inflected, quite complicated grammatical structure. That means words change their form, their endings, usually depending on their function in the sentence. Nouns had cases, verbs conjugated extensively.
Like Latin or German today?
Precisely. And even within the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it wasn't uniform. The language varied quite widely across the major dialects. You had Northumbrian up north, Mercian in the middle, West Saxon in the southwest, and Kentish in the southeast.
But one became dominant.
Yes, post-Alfred, we'll get to him later, the West Saxon dialect became the standardized literary language, mostly because that was the dialect used by the most powerful kingdom, Wessex, whose documentation, whose manuscripts, survived in the greatest numbers.
Right. Now, what's truly staggering, especially given the sheer span of time we're talking about over 600 years, is how little material actually survives.
The scarcity is profound. It really shapes our understanding or lack thereof in some areas. We estimate only about 30,000 lines of Anglo-Saxon poetry survive today.
30,000 over 6 centuries.
Think about it. It's incredibly small. This strongly suggests that the overwhelming majority of the poetry, especially the pagan and secular heroic material, which was almost certainly passed down orally for generations.
Right, sung in halls.
Exactly. Most of it was probably never committed to parchment. Or if it was subsequently lost to fire, war, neglect, the dissolution of the monasteries later on. Just lost to time.
And what we do have, the reason it survived at all, is largely thanks to the church, isn't it?
Precisely. The material that survived is, generally speaking, overtly or subtly religious in content. We owe its preservation primarily to the work of Christian monks. Especially in the late 9th and 10th centuries, they undertook this massive, often difficult work of copying and preserving these texts.
And these texts are held in just a few key collections.
Almost all the surviving poetry is contained in just 4 major manuscript collections. These has become essentially the foundation of the entire field of study.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have the Exeter Book. It's a real treasure trove, holding many of the great lyrical and elegiac poems, the sad, beautiful stuff we'll talk about later.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the Junius manuscript, sometimes called the Kedmon manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
This one is dedicated almost entirely to paraphrases of biblical narratives. Third is the Vercelli book, which holds important poems like Andreas and Aline.
Okay.
And finally, the big one in some ways, the Noel Codex. It's a late 10th century manuscript, famous primarily because it contains the only surviving copy of Beowulf.
The only copy.
The only one. That single text, the most important heroic epic we have, survived in one single book. It was almost lost entirely.
Wow. The idea that, one fire, one misplaced volume could have wiped out our entire understanding of the Germanic heroic tradition. It's genuinely chilling.
It is.
But let's turn to the mechanics. How does a poem actually work in Old English? If it doesn't rhyme in the way we expect, what holds it together? What organizes it?
Right. This is where we have to shift completely away from what modern listeners expect from poetry. Anglo-Saxon verse operates based on heavy stress and alliteration, not end rhyme.
Stress and alliteration.
Yes. It's a rhythmic, almost thumping structure. It was clearly designed for oral performance, for being spoken or chanted aloud.
Okay, break that down a bit. How does a line work?
The foundational unit is the line, and it's typically characterized by having 4 heavily stressed syllables.
4 main beats per line.
Exactly. And crucially, these 4 stresses are divided into 2 half lines by a strong pause right in the middle. That pause is called the caesura.
So the line is literally cut in half by a break.
Yes. And what holds those two halves together, what links them across the caesura, is alliteration.
Okay, how does the alliteration work specifically?
The basic rule is that at least one, and usually both, of the stressed syllables in the first half line must alliterate start with the same sound as the first stressed syllable of the second half line.
Ah, okay. So the sound repeats across the pause.
Precisely. And importantly, the number of unstressed syllables floating around these four strong beats can vary quite a bit. This gives the poetry a highly variable rhythm in one sense, but it's anchored by this fundamentally powerful four-beat alliterative pulse.
We probably need a clear example here, because this is really the technical heart of how this poetry sounds and feels. Maybe not a complex Old English line, but something translated that shows the structure.
Sure, a line from Beowulf that often gets translated clearly to show this structure might sound something like, "Then the hall resounded, heroes wept aloud."
Okay, I hear it. Hall, heroes, 8 sound linking across the pause.
Exactly. Or another common rendering might be, Grendel gnashed his teeth, God's own anger flared. You hear the G sound connecting the two halves.
Yeah, definitely. 4 stresses, the pause, the linking sound.
In the original Old English, that stress and alliteration is even stronger, even more pronounced. That structure makes the poetry incredibly memorable, which speaks directly to its origins as an oral tradition.
That makes perfect sense. The heavy alliteration, the strong rhythm, the repetition, these would have been essential memory aids for the Saka.
The scup, yes. The minstrel or poet. He would have been performing these stories, maybe even improvising parts of them, probably in the mead hall, maybe with harp accompaniment.
So the texts we have are basically transcriptions.
They are. They're transcriptions often undertaken by monks who were already centuries removed from the original composition or performance context.
Which means they might have changed things.
It certainly means that the Christian scribes were actively engaged in, well, sometimes interpolation, adding religious commentary, maybe clarifying things from their perspective, or subtly revising the material to fit better within their own theological framework. There's always that layer between us and the original oral performance.
Right. Let's focus then on that fundamental worldview carried by this verse 4. We talked earlier about the Germanic heroic ideal versus the Christian overlay. Can you unpack that heroic ideal a bit more?
Sure. The core of the heroic ideal, as we see it in the poetry, seems to be defined by about 4 key things. First, martial prowess, just sheer strength and skill in battle.
Okay.
Second, unwavering loyalty, specifically to the comitatus. That's the crucial bond between a lord and his retainers, his war band. Absolute loyalty, often sealed with gifts.
Right, the ring giver idea.
Exactly. Third, the necessity of vengeance. If your kin or your lord was killed, the blood feud was a social obligation.
A core part of the justice system in a way.
In a way, yes. And fourth, maybe the most defining characteristic of this world, weird.
Weird. We often hear it translated as fate.
It often is, but fate can sound a bit passive or philosophical, maybe like the Greek moire, whereas I think often presented as something more active, more personal, and maybe more, well, brutal.
Also.
It's often portrayed as an unavoidable personal doom that hangs over individuals and even whole tribes. In the purely pagan worldview reflected in some layers of the poetry, there's generally no hope for a pleasant afterlife or divine salvation in the Christian sense.
What's the goal then?
The only permanence you can achieve is temporary glory through reputation. Your name, your deeds, surviving your death, and the songs of the Scapri. That's the closest thing to immortality.
And then Christianity arrives. And it doesn't just ask them to adopt a new god. It asks them to fundamentally reject that core pessimism, that inevitability of worded.
Exactly. Christianity introduces the concept of God's grace, the possibility of individual salvation, and the promise of an eternal, joyous afterlife. It offers a completely different framework for understanding life, suffering, and death.
And the genius, you're saying, of the Anglo-Saxon literary synthesis is that the Christian writers didn't just erase the old heroic stuff.
No, far from it. They preserved the old heroic structures, the value placed on loyalty, the quest for glory, the descriptions of battle, but they often reframed them. They set them within a moral system where human struggle becomes meaningful because it aligns somehow with God's plan, not just with random, inescapable doom.
So the scribes acted as cultural bridges.
That's a great way to put it. They were the essential cultural bridges that allowed many of the old traditions and stories to survive, often by giving them a new, sometimes subtly altered, redemptive purpose or interpretation.
Okay, when we talk about that heroic ideal surviving, and being synthesized with Christianity. We absolutely have to spend some serious time on Beowulf. It's just such a literary monument, isn't it? It
Yeah.
feels like almost the entire surviving Germanic epic tradition distilled into this one massive poem.
Its significance really cannot be overstated. It is, by far, the longest, the most complete heroic epic poem in the Old English language, and it provides the most comprehensive insight we have into the social structures, the moral values, the cultural background of the Anglo-Saxons.
Even though, and this is the really curious part,
Yeah.
the story isn't actually about the Anglo-Saxons themselves, is it?
That's the perennial fascination of Beowulf, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was almost certainly written down in England. The dialect suggests likely Northumbria, maybe in the late 7th or early 8th century, though our only copy is much later, late 10th century.
Right.
But the entire story, all the characters, all the action, focuses entirely on the history and figures of Scandinavia. We're talking about the Danes and the Geats, who lived in what's now southern Sweden.
So why? Why would Anglo-Saxons in England be writing this epic poem about Danes and Swedes?
Well, this is actually a crucial distinction, and it tells us something important. It demonstrates that the early Anglo-Saxons saw themselves as direct participants in or inheritors of this larger shared Germanic epic background.
Ah, so they felt connected to those stories.
Deeply connected. While the poem was composed, or at least written down in England, the themes and the legendary characters Hrothgar, the monster Grendel, Beowulf himself, these connect English literature directly back to the myths, the legends, the tribal histories of all the North Sea peoples. It's a powerful testament to the memory of their continental origins.
Okay, let's make sure everyone listening has a firm grasp of the basic narrative structure. It's more than just man fights monsters, right? It traces a whole life through three major conflicts.
That's right. The structure is quite classic epic in a way. It traces the hero's arc from youthful glory to heroic death in old age, and each of the three central conflicts serves a different kind of thematic purpose.
So what's the first part?
The first phase is all about establishing reputation. We meet Beowulf as this young, incredibly strong warrior from Geatland. He hears about the troubles of King Hrothgar over in Denmark. Hrothgar's great mead hall, Heorot, this symbol of community and celebration, has been terrorized for years by the monster Grendel.
Right, Grendel comes every night.
Exactly. He attacks the sleeping warriors. So Beowulf sails to Denmark with his warband, offers his services, and famously defeats Grendel in hand-to-hand combat, ripping his arm off. It upholds the heroic values of strength, courage, and service to others in need.
Okay, a great victory.
Mm.
But the story doesn't end there. The second fight escalates things significantly, doesn't it? It brings in that element of revenge, the blood feud.
Precisely. Grendel, it turns out, has a mother, and she attacks Heorot seeking vengeance for her son's death, which is, you have to remember, a perfectly understandable, even expected action under the old Germanic code. An eye for an eye.
So Beowulf has to deal with her too.
He does. And this time, he has to descend into this terrifying hidden lair beneath a swampy lake. It's like he's literally leaving the known world, the world of the hall, behind to confront this primal female power. He eventually kills her with a giant sword he finds in her cave. He's acting here to avenge the loss Hrothgar suffered, fulfilling another cornerstone of their ethical system.
Two monsters down. Then there's a big time jump.
A huge jump. The final, and I think most poignant, most tragic conflict occurs 50 years later. Beowulf has returned home, eventually become king of the Geats, and ruled wisely and successfully for decades. He's an old man now.
And then
Then a dragon, which has been sleeping for centuries guarding a massive hoard of ancient treasure, is disturbed when a runaway slave steals a single cup.
Uh-oh.
Indeed. The dragon awakens in fury and starts burning Beowulf's kingdom. And Beowulf, even though he's old, feels it's his duty as king to protect his people and, importantly, to win that treasure for them.
He knows it's likely suicide, though.
He senses it. He goes to fight the dragon, knowing it probably means his death. And it does. He manages to kill the dragon with the help of only one loyal young warrior, Wiglaf, but he's mortally wounded in the process. He dies, but he saves his people from the dragon's wrath, and he wins the hoard.
That third fight, the dragon
Yeah.
fight. It really brings us back to that pagan core you were talking about, doesn't it? It's all about gold, sacrifice, and the importance of the funeral.
Absolutely. The accumulation, the defense, and especially the distribution of treasure gold, rings, weapons, armor. These were central functions of Germanic kingship. A good king was a ring giver, a gold friend. That's how loyalty was maintained.
And the funeral.
The poem spends a lot of time describing Beowulf's magnificent funeral pyre, and then the construction of this massive burial mound, a barrow, built on a headland so ships passing by can see it. This is purely rooted in that pagan quest for earthly immortality through reputation, through memory. The ultimate goal isn't spiritual paradise, it's for your name, your lof, your glory, your praise, to endure after death.
But the poet, presumably a Christian monk, is constantly working against this purely pagan reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does the Christian frame manage to contain or maybe reinterpret such a fundamentally pagan tale?
That's the fascinating balancing act. The poet doesn't shy away from the pagan core at all. He acknowledges it, respects it even, but he interprets it through a Christian lens.
How? What are the explicit Christian elements?
Well, the most explicit Christian framing comes in the genealogy of the monsters. Grendel and his mother aren't just random beasts. They are explicitly identified as the monstrous descendants of Cain, the first murderer in the Bible.
Ah, so they represent inherent evil stemming from the first sin.
Exactly. They become symbolic manifestations of eternal evil, cosmic outcasts, the result of defying God. This immediately places Beowulf's physical struggles within a much larger, universal moral cosmology. Furthermore, the poet subtly weaves in references to the creation story from Genesis and mentions Noah's flood. There are moments where characters give thanks to God for victory or safe passage. This serves to align Beowulf's incredible physical might, the strength he relies upon, not with just luck or random chance or even weird alone.
But with God's grace.
Yes, or at least operating within a world ultimately governed by God's providence. The human struggle for justice, for order against chaos, for protection of the community is implicitly seen as being validated, perhaps even sanctioned by God, even if the hero himself isn't explicitly Christian in his beliefs or motivations.
So that synthesis means the poem is doing some heavy theological work, isn't it? It's making the old heroic struggle seem morally comprehensible, even admirable to a newly Christian audience, but without sacrificing the fierce energy and tragedy of the original tale.
That is the absolute key literary achievement, I think. The Christian scribe, or poet, didn't just copy down an old pagan myth. He performed a really detailed, sophisticated act of cultural translation. He allowed the audience to celebrate Beowulf's heroic virtues, to mourn his tragic fall, the inevitable failure of even the greatest earthly strength against time and wired, while simultaneously, subtly, offering the Christian alternative. That ultimate permanence, true victory, lies beyond the funeral pyre, beyond the barrow, in the eternal realm of God.
Let's just push on that concept of weird one more time.
Yeah.
Because you said it's different from Christian ideas of fate or providence. How does the Anglo-Saxon poet use Weird to drive the tragedy, even while giving nods to God's power?
Right. Weird in the poem often feels impersonal, maybe unconcerned, and ultimately irresistible on the earthly plane. In the purely pagan context, the world often seems destined for ruin, cold, decay. A concept you see captured perfectly in the elegies we'll discuss later. Beowulf definitely acknowledges Weird as a powerful force.
Especially in that final fight.
Absolutely. When Beowulf goes to fight the dragon, there's a strong sense that he knows he is fighting his fate, meeting his doom. The poet gives full voice to that feeling of grim inevitability. Beowulf himself says something like, "Weird has swept them all away."
But the Christian framing softens it slightly.
It subtly mitigates the sheer, bleak terror of Weird as the only force. By attributing the strength that allows Beowulf to fight so heroically, even in death, sometimes implicitly to God's favor, the poet suggests that while earthly power and life are transient, subject to Weird, the moral purpose behind the fighting courage, loyalty, self-sacrifice for the community might have an eternal resonance.
So Weird still reigns on Earth, maybe, but there's a higher power?
That's the tension. Weird still seems to dictate the when and how of death, the earthly outcome. But the Christian God presides over the why, the moral significance, and the ultimate destiny of the soul. This tension is maintained masterfully throughout the poem, giving it its complex emotional depth. It's not a simple answer.
Okay, so as the church became more established, became the center of literacy and learning, the poetry naturally shifted focus, didn't it? The subject matter became more overtly religious. We moved from synthesizing pagan heroes to celebrating Christian figures and biblical stories.
That's a major development, yes.
And this leads us to the first English poet whose name we actually know, Cædmon.
Ah, Cædmon. His story is so important, partly because it establishes this idea of a divine origin for English vernacular poetry itself. Almost everything we know about him comes from one source, the great historian Bede.
Bede, writing in the early 8th century.
Exactly, in his famous Ecclesiastical History of the English People.
And Bede tells this incredible story about Cædmon. He wasn't a trained scholar or anything.
Not at all. He was, according to Bede, an illiterate cowherd. He worked at the double monastery of Whitby up in Northumbria, which was run by the abbess Hild. And apparently he was so shy, or maybe felt so inadequate, that when the harp was passed around in the evenings in the hall for people to sing.
A core social activity, right?
A core activity. He would apparently get up and leave because he felt ashamed he couldn't compose or sing anything.
Okay, so then comes the miracle. The divine inspiration. It sounds like a perfect story for promoting Christian literacy among a newly converted, maybe still largely oral populace.
It's a powerful foundation myth for English Christian poetry, absolutely. The story recounts that one night, Cædmon had withdrawn, maybe sleeping in the cowshed, and a figure appeared to him in a dream or a vision.
The heavenly figure.
Yes, and this figure said, "Cædmon, sing me something." Cædmon protested, I can't sing. But the voice insisted, commanding him specifically to sing about the beginning of created things.
Wow. And he just could.
Instantly, according to Bede, he received the divine gift of song, the Skapkraft, and began composing beautiful Christian verse in his native Old English, praising God, the Creator.
So Cædmon is heralded as the first recognized English poet. But how much of his work actually survives?
That's the tricky part. The only work that is universally attributed to him today, the only piece that survives in very early manuscripts, often alongside Bede's own Latin text, is a short, powerful 9-line prayer. It's known as Cædmon's hymn.
Just 9 lines.
Just 9 lines that we can confidently say are his. It praises God as the creator of heaven and earth.
But his name is often attached to a much larger body of work, isn't it? There's this idea of the Cædmonian school of poetry found in that manuscript you mentioned earlier, the Junius manuscript.
Yes, that's right. The Junius manuscript contains these large-scale biblical narratives, poems retelling stories like Genesis, actually 2 different versions, Genesis A and B, Exodus, and Daniel.
Are they by Cædmon?
For a long time, people assumed they were, based on Bede's account of Cædmon composing on biblical themes, but modern scholarship generally considers them to be the work of later poets, perhaps inspired by Cædmon or working in a similar tradition. So we often refer to them as belonging to the Cædmonian school.
Okay, so what defines that school's style? Even if they aren't all by Cædmon himself, what connects these poems?
What's really critical and fascinating is how they adapted the existing poetic techniques. These poets were masters of adaptation.
Adaptation of what?
They took the raw, vigorous, heroic language, the alliterative, stressed verse, the formulas, the rhetorical devices that had been developed for pagan epic warfare and heroic tales.
Like in Beowulf.
Exactly like in Beowulf. And they applied that entire poetic toolkit directly to biblical subjects. They essentially used the language of the battlefield to describe the struggles of the Israelites or the actions of biblical figures.
Can you give an example? You mentioned kennings earlier, those compressed metaphors like whale road for the sea. Did the Cædmonian poets use those?
Oh, absolutely. They applied kennings directly to God and other figures of power. Instead of just using a simple Latin-derived term like deus or the Old English god, they used existing Germanic heroic terms, which would have made the Christian deity more relatable, more understandable perhaps, to a warrior class culture.
What kind of kennings for God?
God is frequently referred to using terms like heaven's guardian, Hafen is weird, glory's king, Woldersaning, or mankind's shepherd, Monsonny's weird. These frame God in terms of protection, kingship, lordship concepts central to their existing social structure.
And in the narratives themselves, like the Exodus poem.
Yes, in the Cædmonian poem Exodus, the poet describes the Israelites' flight from Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea using the full descriptive power of the heroic style. The Egyptian army isn't just defeated, they're described like a doomed warband. The sea isn't just water, it becomes this hostile, terrifying environment. The whale road turned into a weapon against the Egyptians.
So they're transforming the sacred stories into something intensely visceral and Germanic.
That's exactly it. That transformation, that ability to clothe biblical narrative in the familiar, powerful garments of heroic verse, is the lasting contribution of the Cædmonian poets.
Okay, so if Cædmon represents that earliest divinely inspired tradition, who comes next? Is there another major identified poet from this era?
Yes, there is. The second great identified poet of the Anglo-Saxon period is Cynewulf.
Cynewulf. How do we know his name?
He's one of the very few poets from the era who we can name with absolute certainty thanks to a really remarkable literary quirk. He wove his name, spelled out in runes, into the epilogues of 4 of his poems. It acts like a hidden signature.
Runes. Wow. When did he live?
He lived roughly a century or maybe 2 after Cædmon, placing him probably in the late 8th or early 9th century. His dialect suggests he might have been from Northumbria or perhaps Mercia.
And what are the 4 signed poems? And how did Cynewulf's style maybe signal a new development in English poetry compared to the Cædmonian school?
The 4 poems definitively signed by Cynewulf are The Fates of the Apostles, which describes the missions and martyrdoms of the apostles; Elene, a long poem about the legend of St. Helena, Constantine's mother, finding the true cross; Juliana, the story of a female saint's martyrdom; and parts 2 and 3 of a larger collection of poems on the life of Christ, simply called Christ.
Okay, and his style, how was it different?
Cynewulf's craftsmanship generally shows a distinct movement towards greater literary sophistication. While he still uses the traditional heroic meter, the alliterative 4-beat line, his work often incorporates more influences from Latin literature and rhetoric.
Such as?
He uses more complex rhetorical flourishes, more sophisticated narrative structuring, and often quite dramatic dialogues between characters. His poems tend to make the Christian stories feel perhaps more immediately personal and emotionally charged compared to some of the earlier, more straightforward biblical paraphrases.
So a growth in literary self-awareness maybe, moving slightly away from the raw, more formulaic style.
I think that's fair to say. There's a sense of greater authorial control and maybe a stronger connection to learned written traditions, possibly influenced by classical models studied in the monasteries.
Interesting. Now, let's talk about how that heroic journey motif, the idea of wandering and questing that was so central to the Germanic world, continued to be applied in these Christian poems.
Yes, that motif of the heroic journey, the sea voyage, the dangerous quest, the battle against odds was simply too powerful and too ingrained in the culture to disappear entirely. So it gets repurposed.
How so?
Works like Andreas, which tells the legend of St. Andrew, and Guthlac, which describes the life and spiritual battles of the English hermit St. Guthlac, basically transpose this quest narrative into a spiritual context.
So the saint becomes the hero.
Essentially, yes. In Andreas, for example, the Apostle Andrew's sea voyages to rescue his fellow Apostle Matthew, and the dangers he faces from cannibals and demons, are described using the same kind of vivid, detailed language for seafaring and battle that you find in Beowulf. The apostle becomes a kind of spiritual adventurer, battling foes both physical and demonic, undertaking a perilous journey for a higher cause.
Before we move entirely away from poems with that strong heroic vein, we absolutely have to mention the powerful fragment of Judith. It's often overshadowed by Beowulf, maybe, but it's preserved right alongside it in that same Noel Codex manuscript.
Ah, Judith. Yes, it's a truly remarkable text, even though it's only a fragment of what was likely a longer poem. It translates the biblical story from the Book of Judith, where the Jewish widow Judith saves her people by decapitating the invading Assyrian general Holofernes while he's drunk in his tent.
And it's known for being particularly vigorous.
Vigorous is an understatement. It's renowned for its sheer energy, its dramatic tension, and its incredibly graphic depiction of the beheading and the subsequent battle. The poet celebrates Judith as this fierce, cunning, and divinely inspired female protagonist, a true heroic figure in her own right.
So the poet treats it like a Germanic battle scene.
Completely. Judith's confrontation with Holofernes, her prayer for strength, the act of killing him, and the way the Israelites then attacked the leaderless Assyrian camp, it's all described with the kind of bloody intensity and heroic language you'd expect from a poem about a pagan warrior raid. It really proves that the heroic alliterative style remained capable of incredibly powerful, intense expression right up into the 10th century, even when dealing with biblical subject matter.
Okay, so we've covered the big epics like Beowulf and the major Christian narrative poems from Cædmon's school and Cynewulf. These feel like large, public, maybe ceremonial works in many ways. But the sources, especially that Exeter book you mentioned, also point to a completely different kind of poetry. Shorter, much more personal, often defined by sadness and solitude. This is the elegiac tradition, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the Exeter book is our primary source for this incredibly moving body of work. The elegies tap into what seems to be a profound sense of isolation, loss, and melancholy that runs deep in the Anglo-Saxon psyche, or at least as is represented in the surviving literature.
What's the core theme here?
The defining theme, repeated across several poems, is the ubi sunt motif. It's Latin, meaning, where are they?
Where are they now?
Exactly. It's the lament for lost joys, vanished companions, ruined halls, the transience of all earthly things, wealth, power, beauty, life itself. Where are the horses? Where's the rider? Where's the giver of treasure? That kind of questioning.
And these poems you mentioned earlier, they represent a fusion.
They really do. They represent the profound emotional core of the culture's transition, I think. They perfectly fuse the very real, very Germanic pain of losing your lord, your warband, your place in the hall. The breakdown of that vital comitatus bond, which meant social death, with the Christian necessity of seeking comfort and stability not in this fleeting world, but in the eternal.
So acknowledging that everything of this world must fail and finding solace elsewhere.
Precisely. They articulate the sorrow of earthly loss, but frame it within a larger understanding that true permanence is found only with God.
Let's maybe analyze the two most famous elegies because they really seem to encapsulate this perfectly. The Wanderer and the Seafarer. Can you unpack the Wanderer first?
The Wanderer is, in many ways, the quintessential statement of this entire elegiac tradition. The speaker is an earth stepper, a wanderer. He's explicitly described as a man who has lost his lord, his gold friend, his comrades, and his mead hall. Literally, the center of his social world is gone.
He's an exile.
He is. He's roaming alone on the cold winter seas, dreaming of past joys but waking to the harsh reality of his solitude. He reflects on the ruins of fortifications, the empty stone walls where feasting used to happen, the memory of fallen warriors. He contemplates the universal fate, how all earthly glory fades.
But it doesn't end in despair.
No, it reaches a kind of synthesis. The memory of the pagan joy, the warmth of the hall, the loyalty of the comrades that's described with real power and nostalgia. But the stark realization of inevitable decay, of weird acting on the world, leads him ultimately to the conclusion that true security, true consolation for, lies only with the Father in heaven. The emotional arc moves beautifully from deep, tribal, heroic sorrow to a kind of resigned, stoic Christian acceptance.
And the Seafarer uses the natural world, the ocean itself, almost as a direct parallel for the speaker's internal state, doesn't it?
It does, brilliantly. The Seafarer presents this fascinating paradox. The speaker vividly describes the excruciating physical hardship of life at sea, the freezing spray, the ice-cold feet, the howling storms, the intense loneliness, the constant danger from the waves. It sounds absolutely miserable.
Yeah, who would choose that?
Exactly. But then, paradoxically, the speaker feels this relentless, almost spiritual hunger for the sea, for adventure, for exploration. The very hardship seems to draw him back.
Why?
The poem suggests that the literal journey across the harsh, desolate ocean becomes a powerful metaphor. It's a metaphor for the soul's necessary journey through the trials and tribulations of this earthly life, this dead life lent on land, towards the true home, the eternal joy of heaven.
So the old heroic desire for adventure and discovery, once tied maybe to raiding or trading voyages,
Is now internalized. It's applied to the soul's journey. The lure of the cuckoo song in spring doesn't just call him to another sea voyage, but reminds him of the call to leave the transient world behind and seek the eternal. It's another masterful blend of the Germanic seafaring spirit with Christian aspiration.
these works are incredibly powerful because they give us this glimpse into the individual psyche, the internal struggle. And the Exeter book also contains works that feel even more intensely personal, maybe even more ambiguous, moving beyond that public sphere of male warrior duty. I'm thinking particularly of The Wife's Lament.
Ah, The Wife's Lament. Yes, this is one of the most enigmatic and emotionally raw poems in the entire corpus. What makes it stand out immediately is that the speaker is clearly a woman.
Which is rare in itself.
Extremely rare in the surviving literature. She describes being separated from her husband, though the Old English word could also mean lord, so the exact relationship is debated. She seems to be living in exile, possibly due to a family feud or her husband's actions, forced to dwell in this miserable earth hall, a cave under an oak tree in a desolate landscape.
And she's just mourning.
She's mourning her lost happiness, her separation, perhaps cursing the kinsman who caused the rift. The poem's incredible power stems from its raw, direct emotional expression of love, loyalty, loss, and bitter resentment. It's a rare, vital window into the potential private life and emotional structure of women in this period.
And the ambiguity about why she's separated only adds to it.
It absolutely does. Is her husband also exiled? Did he betray her? Is she a victim of political maneuvering? We don't know, and that uncertainty makes her isolation and sorrow feel even more profound. There's also a companion piece sometimes discussed alongside it, the husband's message, which seems to involve a message carved on wood, possibly from an exiled husband to his wife, but it's also quite cryptic.
Okay, let's turn back to the physical world for a moment, tying that elegiac feeling of decay and loss directly back to the very starting point of the Anglo-Saxon period, the Roman withdrawal. You mentioned a poem called The Ruin.
Yes, The Ruin. This is another fascinating piece, also found in the Exeter book. It's essentially a meditation on the decay of past greatness. But the greatness isn't Anglo-Saxon, it's Roman.
So the poem describes Roman ruins.
Exactly. The speaker is contemplating the remains of a deserted Roman city. Scholars often suggest it might be Bath, with its famous hot springs, or perhaps Chester. The poem vividly describes these enormous stone structures, the intricate masonry, the bathing halls, the high walls, all now crumbled, broken, covered in moss, silent. The work of giants, anti-Work, is how the Anglo-Saxons often referred to such ruins.
What's the feeling it evokes?
It evokes a powerful sense of mystery, awe, and melancholy. The Anglo-Saxons, who typically built in wood, must have looked at these massive stone remnants left by the departed Romans with a mixture of wonder and perhaps unease. The ruin captures that perfectly. The speaker marvels at the skill of the vanished builders, imagines the bustling, luxurious life that once filled the city, but ultimately concludes that even this mighty civilization, this great physical strength, was subject to decay. Too weird.
So it connects the Anglo-Saxon present directly to that lost Roman past.
It does, using the familiar elegiac motif of decay and transience to reflect on the fate of empires and the passage of time. It's a poignant piece of cultural self-reflection, looking back at the ghosts of the previous inhabitants of the land.
Now, before we leave the Exeter book entirely, we absolutely must touch on its more playful side. We mentioned intellectual sophistication earlier, and the famous collection of riddles really proves that this was a culture that valued wit, metaphor, and wordplay.
Absolutely. The Exeter book contains nearly 100 Old English riddles, and they are just fantastic. They demonstrate that Anglo-Saxon learning wasn't solely about, high theological drama or lamenting lost lords. It had a highly developed, playful, clever, and sophisticated intellectual component.
How do they work? What are they like?
They challenge the listener or reader to guess a common object. It could be a weapon like a shield or a sword, a piece of clothing like a coat of mail, a tool like a plow, an animal, sometimes even something quite humble like an onion or dough, or a natural phenomenon like a thunderstorm or an iceberg.
And how is the object described?
It's described in deliberately elaborate, often highly suggestive, sometimes paradoxical, and frequently anthropomorphic terms. The object often speaks in the first person. I am a warrior, I travel widely. The poets use kennings and the alliterative verse structure itself to mask the object's identity while giving tantalizing clues. They show a real delight in the clever manipulation of language and metaphor and in looking at the world in unexpected ways.
So a lot more going on than just heroic epics and sad elegies.
Definitely. The range is quite remarkable.
This feels like a clear pivot point, though. The sources suggest that after the 10th century, the great output of heroic and elegiac poetry seems to diminish significantly. The main literary focus seems to shift quite dramatically away from verse, meant primarily for recitation and memory, towards prose meant for reading, instruction, and administration. Why that dramatic transition?
That's a really important shift. The transition seems to have been driven largely by need and practicality. While poetry was absolutely essential for cultural memory, celebration, and expressing deep emotion, the growing needs of the Christian church and the increasingly organized Anglo-Saxon kingdoms required something else.
What do they need?
They needed durable, clear, understandable texts for religious instruction, for law, for administration, for recording history accurately. And this need became particularly acute, almost desperate, following the devastating Viking invasions that began in the late 8th century and intensified dramatically in the 9th.
How did the Vikings affect literature?
The Viking raids specifically targeted monasteries, which were the primary centers of learning and manuscript production. Libraries were burned, scholars were killed or dispersed. Literacy, especially Latin literacy, declined sharply. This created an educational crisis, which required a systemic, practical solution.
A solution provided by one particularly famous king.
A solution provided, most famously and effectively, by King Alfred the Great.
Right. The shift towards a durable, institutionalized English prose tradition is absolutely inseparable from King Alfred. He reigned in Wessex from 871 to 899. We often remember him as a military hero, the king who stopped the Vikings who burned the cakes.
Yes, the popular image.
But his truly lasting contribution, arguably, was as an educational and literary reformer.
His role was monumental, absolutely fundamental to the future of the English language, actually. When Alfred came to the throne, Wessex was reeling from the constant Viking onslaught, and Alfred realized that learning, especially Latin literacy, had decayed terribly, not just among the laity, but even among the clergy and the nobility.
He lamented this himself, didn't he?
He did. In the preface to one of his translations, he famously lamented how few people south of the Humber, even among the priests, could understand the Latin of their own services or translate a letter from Latin into English. He recognized that a strong, stable Christian kingdom could not survive, let alone flourish, without an educated leadership capable of understanding theological, historical, and philosophical concepts.
And his solution was radical for the time. He didn't just say everyone must learn Latin better. He believed in vernacular education.
It was revolutionary. Alfred initiated this comprehensive, state-sponsored program to translate what he considered the most essential Latin works into English specifically, into the West Saxon dialect spoken in his kingdom.
Why English?
He made it crystal clear in his own writings. While Latin was still necessary for those who intended to proceed to holy orders, he believed strongly that all freeborn youth in his kingdom who had the means should first be taught to read and write in their native English tongue. Only then should those destined for higher roles learn Latin.
That's a huge statement about the value of English.
It's immense. This act effectively established the West Saxon dialect as the standardized literary and administrative language of England for the next couple of centuries. He was consciously elevating English to be a language of serious learning.
So he wasn't just translating specific books. He was building a necessary literary infrastructure for the language itself, ensuring it could survive and thrive as a medium for complex thought.
That's exactly what he was doing.
What were the key texts that he and his circle of scholars focus on translating?
They focused on what Alfred deemed the most necessary books for all men to know. Basically, the 4 essential pillars of knowledge needed for the intellectual and spiritual survival of the kingdom at that time.
Okay, what's the first?
Number 1, Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care. This was a handbook for bishops on how to properly care for the spiritual needs of their flock. Absolutely essential guidance for the clergy. And Alfred's own preface to this translation is a crucial historical document in itself, detailing the decline of learning and outlining his whole educational mission.
Right, the State of England Address.
Yeah.
Second,
Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Translating this provided the English people with their own national history, written from a Christian perspective, connecting their identity to the larger narrative of Christendom, giving them a past.
very important for identity. Third,
Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. This was a major philosophical work from late antiquity dealing with questions of fate, free will, and finding happiness amidst suffering. It provided moral and philosophical reasoning. And Alfred didn't just translate it, he heavily adapted it, inserting his own commentaries, Christian interpretations, and even relevant Anglo-Saxon examples to make it more accessible.
so he made it his own, in a way. And the fourth,
Fourth, Orosius's Histories Against the Pagans, often just called his Universal History. This offered a sweeping historical view of the world from creation up to the 5th century, all interpreted through a Christian lens, arguing that Christian times were actually better than pagan times.
theology, history, philosophy, world history, a complete curriculum, almost.
Pretty much. Through this ambitious project, Alfred ensured that fundamental theological, historical, and philosophical knowledge was immediately accessible in English to all educated Englishmen. He guaranteed that English could function as a high-culture language of learning, not just, the everyday tongue of the common people.
This huge translational effort really gives English the durable structure it needed. But what about original prose writing in English? Was there a major work that emerged under Alfred's direction?
Yes, there was, and it's arguably even more significant in the long run. That would undoubtedly be the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Ah, the Chronicle.
It seems to have begun under Alfred's guidance, possibly inspired by his interest in history and the need for accurate records. It's considered the first great sustained work of original prose narrative in the English language.
What exactly was it?
It started as a systematic year-by-year historical record. It charted events affecting the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, beginning retrospectively with Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain and continuing right up through the contemporary events of Alfred's reign and beyond.
And its significance is huge.
It's twofold, really. First, it gave English culture this sense of durable, continuous historical documentation in its own language, a national memory written down. Second, and equally important, wasn't just a single book finished under Alfred, it became a living document.
How so?
Different versions of the Chronicle were kept, copied, and updated independently by various monasteries across England for centuries. The most famous example is the Peterborough Chronicle, which continued its entries right into the mid-12th century, well over 70 years after the Norman conquest.
Wow. So it bridged the
It
conquest.
did, and this incredible longevity cemented the English prose style. It proved that English was a vehicle capable of complex, relatively objective historical recording, not just, emotional poetry or religious instruction. It gave the language resilience.
Okay, so Alfred lays this incredible foundation. And following him, the prose tradition didn't just continue, it exploded, didn't it? Culminating in the late 10th and early 11th centuries with two really massive figures, Elfric and Wulfstan. We should probably compare them, as they seem to represent the absolute pinnacle of this period's prose achievement.
They really do. They are the brilliant culmination of the Alfredian revival of learning and vernacular writing. You have Elfric first, chronologically. He lived roughly from 955 to about 1020. He was primarily a monk, a scholar, a product of the monastic reform movement, the quintessential theological educator.
And incredibly prolific.
Amazingly so. His main goal was to provide accessible, orthodox, sound Christian teaching in clear English, primarily for the clergy but also for the literate laity. He wanted to ensure people weren't being led astray by dodgy translations or interpretations.
What defined Elfric's prose style, he's often praised for it.
Clarity, above all. Clarity, precision, and a remarkably polished, smooth rhythm. His major works were the Catholic Homilies, Sermons for the Church Year, the Lives of Saints, stories of saints' lives for devotional reading, and also a translation of parts of the Old Testament, often called his Hexateuch, the first 6 books.
And the style itself.
His style is often called homiletic, meaning it was carefully structured, often using balanced clauses and rhetorical patterns suitable for public delivery, for preaching. What's really interesting is that he frequently borrowed techniques from Old English poetry, especially alliteration and rhythmic patterns, but he tamed them, made them less obvious, using them to give his prose an undeniable grace and elegance.
So it's almost like verse, but not quite.
Exactly. It's a highly controlled, rhythmic prose. He managed to make complex theological concepts clear and memorable without sacrificing intellectual rigor. He really established a high, formal, literary standard for English theological writing that was hugely influential.
Okay, so Elfric is the cool, clear, elegant scholar and teacher. Who was Wulfstan? He sounds quite different.
In sharp contrast stands Wulfstan. He died in 1023. He wasn't just a monk. He rose to become Archbishop of York, a major political and ecclesiastical figure. And if Elfric was the patient teacher, Wulfstan was the fiery prophet, the impassioned orator.
His work reflects that.
Completely. His writing is far less focused on careful scholarship or elegant phrasing and much more on dramatic, urgent, powerful rhetoric. He was writing and preaching during a time of intense crisis.
Right. The renewed, devastating Danish invasions under Svein Forkbeard and Canute the Great were happening around the turn of the millennium.
Precisely. And Wulfstan's most famous work, the Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, which means the Sermon of the Wolf to the English, lupus as being his Latin nickname, perfectly captures that dramatic intensity. It was likely delivered around 1014, a time of national disaster.
What's the sermon about?
It's pure, powerful political theology, basically. It's a fierce, blistering denunciation of the state of England. Wulfstan argues passionately that the devastating Danish raids are not just random attacks by pagans, but they are divine punishment. God is punishing the English people for their moral decay, their sinfulness, their corruption, their lack of loyalty, their failure to uphold the law.
Wow. Strong stuff.
Incredibly strong. Wulfstan's style is marked by this relentless, almost pounding use of rhetorical devices, heavy alliteration recalling the old poetry, lists of sins, parallel structures, impassioned repetition, direct accusations, rhetorical questions. He's pounding the message home with tremendous force. It is the language of a great orator, designed to shock, to shame, and ultimately to compel repentance and action through fear and religious fervor.
So the juxtaposition is stark then. Elfric's cool, scholarly elegance, aimed at education and clarity, versus Wulfstan's white-hot, dramatic political commentary, aimed at immediate impact and reform.
It's a perfect illustration of the extreme sophistication and the sheer range that English prose had achieved by the early 11th century. It could do both meticulous instruction and powerful public persuasion.
And these two masters, Elfric and Wulfstan, they really cemented that durable tradition Alfred had started.
They absolutely did. They proved conclusively that English was fully capable of handling the highest levels of theological debate, legal argument, historical narrative, and rhetorical expression. That strong prose backbone, built primarily through Alfred's vision and then perfected by these later writers, would prove to be the ultimate, perhaps unintended mechanism for the language's survival through the trauma that was about to come.
Okay, let's try and bring this massive deep dive together now into some kind of synthesis. We've explored over 6 centuries of literary development, from the pagan scop chanting in the hall, right through to the highly sophisticated Christian prose masters like Elfric and Wulfstan. In your view, looking back over all of it, what stands out as the greatest lasting achievement of Anglo-Saxon literature as a whole?
That's a good question. I think, for me, the greatest achievement really lies in that remarkable and quite unique synthesis they managed to execute. They successfully absorbed and adapted so much foreign material. The Christian spiritual framework, the intellectual weight of Latin learning, certain structural elements maybe from Greco-Roman rhetoric, and they fused it, often quite seamlessly, with their own vigorous native Germanic traditions.
Things like the heroic code.
Exactly. The heroic code, the alliterative verse form itself, the deep emotional resonance of the elegies, the love of riddling wordplay. They made it all work together.
So it shows the era wasn't dark at all.
Far from it. This literature demonstrates that the era was intellectually vibrant, culturally complex. It was characterized by real depth, often that profound melancholy lyricism we talked about, and later by this incredibly durable, well-developed, institutionalized prose style. It reflects a civilization actively engaged in grappling with the truly monumental questions of faith, fate, history, community, the meaning of suffering, the nature of civilization itself.
Okay. And as we close the book on this period, we have to acknowledge the historical boundary we set right at the beginning, the year 1066, the Norman conquest. It changes absolutely everything, doesn't it? It seems to bring this entire flourishing literary tradition to a sudden grinding halt.
The impact was immediate, and for the literary function of English, it was catastrophic. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings ushered in a French-speaking ruling class, aristocracy, high clergy, administrators.
And French became the language of power.
Completely. Norman French became the language of the court, of law, of government, of high culture. English was almost instantly suppressed in those high-status domains. High status now meant speaking French. Latin, of course, remained the international language of the church and formal learning. English was relegated largely to the language of the conquered majority.
And linguistically, this intense pressure must have had a huge effect on English itself.
Massive. It dramatically accelerated the changes that were probably already underway. Old English, with its complex inflections and grammar, began to simplify rapidly into what we now call Middle English. It shed many of those grammatical endings. And of course, there was a huge influx of French vocabulary, thousands of words related to government, law, food, fashion, art.
And the poetry, the alliterative verse.
The elaborate, forced-stress, alliterative poetry tradition largely disappeared, at least from the written record, for a long time. It lost its aristocratic audience, its primary social function in the hall. It survived underground, perhaps, in folk traditions, and eventually reemerged in different forms much later. But the high-status literary tradition was broken.
Yet, the English language itself obviously survived. And eventually, centuries later, it reemerged as the dominant literary tongue of England again. If the poetry faded, what element of the Anglo-Saxon tradition that we've discussed provided the crucial foundation for that later reemergence? What allowed it to endure?
It has to be the prose. This, I think, is the ultimate practical legacy of King Alfred and his successors like Elfric and Wulfstan. While the heroic poetry tradition fractured and went largely underground or died out among the elite, the tradition of English literary prose, established under Alfred's insistence, proven capable by the Chronicle, honed to perfection by Elfric and Wulfstan, had demonstrated its utility and its durability.
How did that help?
Because English prose was already established as a language capable of serious intellectual work, theological discussion, historical record-keeping, legal documentation, and practical instruction. It continued to be used, albeit in less prestigious contexts, in sermons and devotional writing, even in some administrative records. That continuous functional prose tradition, that infrastructural groundwork, meant that English remained a viable, living language of record and instruction, even under intense French pressure.
So when authors like Chaucer finally emerged centuries later,
They weren't starting from scratch. They had a literary lineage, however disrupted, to draw upon. They had a language that had already proven it could handle complex thought. That prose tradition was the anchor that allowed English to survive the storm of the conquest and eventually resurface.
Okay, so here is the final thought we want to leave you, the listener, with today.
Mhm.
Something to take away from this entire deep dive, something to maybe mull over that connects this distant past to the future of the language we're using right now.
We've seen just how fragile the survival of these key texts was: Beowulf in one manuscript, most of the poetry in just four main books. We've also seen how crucial Alfred's deliberate, state-sponsored project to build a prose tradition in English was. This raises, I think, an important counterfactual question for you to consider. If Anglo-Saxon England, specifically Wessex in the late 9th century under King Alfred, had not made that conscious decision, had not established and institutionalized such a robust, comprehensive program of literary prose translation and original composition before the Norman conquest hit in 1066, if English had primarily remained just a language of oral poetry and everyday speech,
Then what?
then would the intense, prolonged French cultural and administrative dominance after 1066 have succeeded in effectively extinguishing English as a significant literary language altogether? Could English have ended up like, say, Gaelic in Scotland or Ireland, a cherished but ultimately marginalized tongue in the face of a powerful imported language? Was that specific, practical, intellectual groundwork laid by Alfred, Elfric, and Wulfstan the ultimate, perhaps unplanned survival mechanism for the language that you and I are speaking right now?
A truly fascinating and slightly sobering thought that the very structure, the resilience, maybe even the existence of modern English as a global language might be owed in part to the political necessity and the dedicated scholarly efforts of a few visionary monks and one very determined king over 1,000 years ago.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the strong, resilient, and often surprising roots of English knowledge. We really hope you feel thoroughly well informed now about the giants of Old English literature. Until next time on the Deep Dive.